Hi everybody, welcome back to Coma UK's Shared Transport Conference. Hope you enjoyed this morning's sessions. If there's anything that you missed, then we will be recording all the sessions and they'll all be posted on our website, on our events page of our website later this week, so you can catch up there. So this session is all about health, particularly bike share and the role that bike share plays in hitting so many of the health agenda policy areas. And has there ever been a time when health has been ever more in the forefront of our minds? We're very acutely aware of the need to be looking after our physical or our mental health. And if you think back to particularly the early lockdowns, we had a time when exercise, going outside was restricted. So we got a newfound appreciation for our time outside, for our ability to exercise, to connect with nature, just to get fresh air, really. And shared transport played an important role in this at that time. Bike share in particular provided opportunities for people to integrate exercise into their everyday journeys, whether they're commuting or doing utility trips, seeing friends and family. And that's what was a really valuable and a real boost for bike share over the last year or so. So over the next 90 minutes, we're going to have 4 presentations. We're going to hear from David Finch of the Health Foundation, who will be looking at that really interesting relationship between transport and health and what lessons we can learn in order to improve our healthy lifestyles. Then we're going to go to Laura Elms, who is Sales Director for HumanForest, and they are running bike share schemes in London, so we'll learn about more of the practical experience. Thirdly, we're going to have a presentation from Tim Jones from Oxford Brookes University, and he's been working on gathering evidence for the benefits of e-bikes. So myth busting, they're called, it's cheating, and showing us that e-bikes really have really good health benefits. And finally, I'll be giving you a preview of the 2020 bike share survey results and leading you some of the highlights from that. So before we do any of that, I have a poll for you. So if you want to kind of have a look at the poll section, hopefully it's showing for you now, but if for any reasons it's not, it's up on screen. Do you see e-bikes as mainstream mode or a niche mode? Where do you think that's changing? Okay. That's really great to see. 75% up to 80% now, certainly a clear leader for mainstream. And what we've found is that bike share itself helped to make cycling mainstream, I think from 10 years ago when the first scheme launched in London, making it an everyday mode on our streets, taking away some of those barriers. And about 5 years ago, we started to see the first e-bikes schemes in bike share, first e-bikes in bike share. And nowadays, we're actually seeing the new operators that are coming to the forefront are actually launching with 100% pure electric. So they clearly see that e-bikes are a mode that's useful for everybody. So we will hear more about that over the next 90 minutes or so. Okay, so I'm getting little messages in my feed that actually David hasn't managed to log in yet. I know he's definitely trying because he's been messaging me. So we will definitely hear from David at some point over the next 90 minutes. But I'm just going to ask Tim Jones, reader in urban mobility at Oxford Brookes University, to kindly kind of fill the gap while we change the order around and to hear more about your research work. So thank you, Tim. Over to you.
Thank you, Antonio, for that introduction. And it was really interesting to see the poll actually on e-bikes, the kind of normality of e-bikes relative to before I was doing the research I'm going to present to you now, where it was very much seen as a niche and abnormal method of pedaling around the city. So my name's Tim Jones. I'm a reader in urban mobility at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm going to basically talk about what I see as the triple crisis at the moment and the role of sustainable travel within that crisis. Then I'll focus a little bit more about the research I did on e-bikes under the Design for Wellbeing programme run by the EPSRC, that's one of the UK research councils, and the Cycle Boom project I ran under that umbrella. And then I'll just do a brief reflection before the end on what I see as the role of e-bikes and broader electric micromobilities for sustainable travel. So first of all, obviously, sustainable transport and e-biking within the sustainable transport domain, if you like, is I see it as within an axis really of three challenges. One, an aging society and how we shape our cities around an aging society is obviously where there's broader themes of pensions and all those sorts of things, healthcare, but just thinking about how we design cities for an aging society. We've also got the climate emergency and transport's role in mitigating and tackling that. And then also the health and well-being issues around obesity and ill health, and particularly around isolation with the COVID pandemic. So really, I would argue that e-biking and sustainable mobility really has a part to play in those three challenges. And I'll explain a little bit more how in the next few slides. I think the point to make, though, is that we need to do this in an equitable manner. And that's always the challenge in pushing forward policies that can have impact on certain sections of society. So we need to really think about how we do it in an equitable as well as a sustainable way. So just to put in context, my area, I'm in the School of the Built Environment. And so I'm very much in the kind of more environmental design elements of how we shape sustainable transport. And so within that, it's obviously widely believed that walking and cycling, or active mobility as they have been constituted, can help to promote moderate physical activity, delay biological aging and age-related conditions, and improve overall health and well-being. And of course, they can also benefit the environment in terms of being more sustainable ways of moving around. I would add, however, that whilst my area and focus is School of the Built Environment, I'm not blind to the broader social and economic levers that can actually shape how people move around. So, but in terms of design and the built environment, obviously there's a strong role to play in terms of how we shape cities to support and promote walking and cycling. Technology also is involved in that, in terms of the vehicles that we'll be moving around with, how they're powered, their size, their shape, and their materials. So it's quite a complex web of things to look at. And so I should add that some previous research that I was involved with in 2008 to 2011 was published in a book called Promoting Walking and Cycling, Policy Press 2013, where we really did make that statement from the deep research we did in 4 English cities on the taking the temperature, if you like, of walking and cycling in the UK and what people thought about walking and cycling in terms of how it's perceived. And we did very much talk about built environment measures, but we also looked at the social and economic environments in which people move around in, and which shapes their mobility. So just to set what I'm going to say in context now, really, that I am aware of the broader issues. But for this presentation, I'd like to focus on the Cycle Boom project, because that really is about e-biking and the experience of older adults using e-bikes. Now, I'm probably going to offend many viewers here when we talked about older people. We very much looked at 50 plus people approaching retirement, if you like, as well as older people who are past retirement. So we were trying to look at aging as a process rather than a biological figure, if you like. So the Design for Wellbeing, Aging and Mobility in the Built Environment call, as I mentioned earlier, came from the EPSRC, and we responded to that with a research programme that very much looked at older cycling in the UK to really understand who cycles amongst the older cohorts, why they cycle, and also to look at the broader trend, if you like, which was away from cycling in older age, to understand how we could support people to, retake up cycling or to carry on cycling as they age. Part of that program also looked at e-biking as well, which I'm really going to focus on for this presentation. So the objective is to understand cycling among the older population, how this affects independence, health and well-being, and also to come up with some policy recommendations for practitioners and people involved in promoting cycling. Little bit of a backstory to that. While I was starting this research, I was also working with colleagues in the Netherlands and really experiencing the landscape there, where, you know, around a third of all trips are by bicycle, and, you know, a massive cohort of older people use the bike. You know, 20% of trips amongst the over 65s are by bicycle, relative to 1% in the UK. And indeed, in Germany, let's take some, you know, somewhere that's not the Netherlands, as that's always given as an example. In Germany, 9% of all journeys in the over 65 plus age group are by bicycle. So clearly scope there for getting older people onto bicycles. Our approach really was looking at policy. How does policy view cycling in terms of, you know, different age groups cycling, in terms of visuals on reports and how cycling's written about, to also analyse the trends of what age groups cycle, and you know, looking at the British Social Attitude Survey and various other big surveys to tease out the detail there. We also conducted study visits in Seville and Munich, obviously Munich in Northern Europe, Germany, and Seville in Southern Europe, Spain, to get a real sense of emergent cities rather than, you know, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, the usual suspects, but to go to places where cycling was really, really on the uptake, and to understand why that was happening. And then for our empirical work, our primary research with people, we conducted biographical interviews with people. We also shadowed riders on their journeys by bicycle, and we also held a cycling and wellbeing trial where we loaned out e-bikes for an 8-week period and asked people to keep well, I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But just to say, the case sites were Bristol, Cardiff, Reading and Oxford. So for the mobile methods, just very briefly, this is an example of pseudonym Sean in his 50s, who had been riding for 15 years from his home in the suburbs of Oxford to the centre, where he worked at the university as a porter at the university. So we followed him on his journey and tried to understand the logic of that journey, his experience, and the rationale behind the routes he took. So here you can see on this, you know, clearly it's not the direct route to Oxford. It's around the ring road here and then in on the southern spur. So, and that was really about separation from traffic and trying to reduce the stress of his journey that he obviously completed in the morning and evening, 5 days a week. So that was to actually, you know, work with many people, many participants, to understand their cycling in the city in situ as it happened. That allowed us to really get an insight into people's experience and to reveal that to policymakers. So this example here is just something from our report, which I'll provide links to at the end of the talk. But this is a cyclist moving up on the inside to a junction, a signalised junction, and then going up onto the pavement, contravening a red light just to turn left. So the point we were making is that, you know, it isn't recalcitrant hoodies on BMXs breaking the law. It's actually respected members of the public in this case who are doing that because they feel that the infrastructure is letting them down. It's putting them at risk. So they've made what they saw as a rational decision to improve their safety and efficiency on the bicycle. Yes, so we kind of highlighted a few key issues here. Obviously, cycling along motor traffic is risky and people didn't like doing that. There's dissatisfaction with the quality of cycle infrastructure, even in the case study of Oxford, cycling city. There was anxiety when forced to share paths with pedestrians. So really questions around legibility and not knowing where to be and not wanting to upset other users. Lack of coherence in terms of expected manoeuvres, like not knowing where to be generally in the city or being dropped out at specific points and not knowing how to continue. And then obviously, as I said, this example shows really adaptation to personal capability by people actually sort of making it up as they go along, if you like, and even including rule breaking. But I want to focus on the e-cycling and wellbeing trial. We had 100 adults aged 50 to 83. They each pledged to cycle 3 times 30 minutes a week over an 8-week period. And they mainly came, we put the advert out there, but the participants we recruited mainly had a desire to reconnect with cycling for health but lacked the confidence or in their ability to cycle. So they hadn't been cycling for 5 years plus, and they wanted to get back into cycling. Obviously, offering them a free e-bike to use for the 8-week period was a big draw for many of the participants, as you can see in the picture here. This young woman is having training from the Bicycle Co-op in Oxford, who provided the training prior to us letting out people on e-bikes just straight into the path of traffic. So they did receive training until they were of the ability to be able to ride on the public highway. I believe that was bike ability 2. So they, different levels of ability, different time periods to get them to that level before they embarked on their 8-week trial. Before they did the trial, we asked them to do some cognitive tests and well-being measures, so we could measure that pre and post 8-week period. We also asked them to keep what we called a diary of cycling experience, so that we could capture the sort of the brute facts of their cycling journeys, what they did, where they went, whether it's for leisure, recreation, that sort of thing, and their experience. But we also asked them to keep a diary of their feelings. So we just said, look, you can write, you can add photographs, you can sketch pictures, you can do whatever you want at the end of the week, just to reflect on how it's made you feel to use the e-bike. This is an example from a participant called Brian, who's his real name, Brian's diary. Brian was in his 80s, and he very studiously and neatly wrote in his diary at the end of the week to explain his experience, and added some photographs into that diary. I'll say more about Brian in a moment. So key findings from that e-cycling and wellbeing trial was that, I should have said actually, that we also had a parallel cycling trial, like a non-e-bike trial, running coterminously with the e-bike trial. So we found that e-bike cyclists spent more time cycling on average a week than the pedal cyclists. And that was mainly down to them exploring and going further with confidence, generally stating in their diaries that, it was great that they could go a little bit further, knowing full well that they could go back on the battery if they needed to, or should I say with assistance from the battery. We had 13 of our participants from the 40 e-bikers go on to purchase an e-bike, which, is kind of a bit of an endorsement really for the technology there, that people felt confident enough to invest the money to go and buy their own e-bike. 2/3 of participants reported that their well-being had improved compared to before taking part in the study. So that was from the well-being measures that we use, and self-reported measures. But interestingly, when people conducted the cognitive tests, the battery of cognitive tests with our neuroscientists, it was demonstrated that they had improved mental function along with their pedal cycling counterparts. But the e-bike users had an improved mental health measure, a larger effect, if you like, for the e-bikers. Again, with a quantitative cognitive test, it doesn't tell us why, but we're able to go back to the diaries and do deep qualitative research to understand, well, how are people articulating their well-being in the diaries? What could be the reasons for people feeling good about using the bikes? So I've just added a little reference there for those that want to delve deeper into the science as to what we did for the cognitive tests. We've also got, for the more kind of human side, away from the kind of stats, the psychological and neuroscientological tests, we also have some videos here, video vignettes on our website, www.cycleboom.org. 12 cycling and wellbeing trial participants give their kind of 5-minute experiences, if you like, of using the e-bike. So Brian's a really good one to look for those who are interested. In his 80s, he had a problem with his hip. He'd been cycling and had to stop because of problems with his hip and knee, and effectively his cycling had diminished, and the e-bike had allowed him to get back up and cycling again with his wife Jill, who was still using a pedal cycle. So they're able to go out together again and rediscover places that they'd gone in the past. And they came out of it obviously exponents of e-biking. Jill also commented that Brian had become sort of almost well again, in terms of she's trying to articulate his well-being, which you'll see at the end of the video. And she kept a parallel diary charting his kind of mood, if you like, and feelings, unbeknown to him, over the course of the e-bike trial, which was quite sweet and enlightening. Yeah, this is just showing Brian's ranging behaviour from his home in Abingdon here, that you can see in the kind of epicentre of the red trails. But his journey is extended out to Wallingford in the southeast, some sort of 15 miles away, and even as far as North Oxford, Hayford in the north of Oxford, the old airbase there. So he really did extend his range above and beyond what he would have been able to do with a pedal cycle. He talked very much about reconnecting with places he'd gone in the past and discovery of new places with the confidence of getting back. The brilliance of being able to share that experience with his partner, which he just didn't imagine he'd be able to do that again. And, as I mentioned, Jill very much talked about his improved self-esteem. So that wasn't his observation. It was very much his wife talking about seeing that improved self-esteem. And this is a quote from Brian, really. You can go 14 miles away with the knowledge that you've got the battery to help you back if you need it. So, giving that confidence to would-be cyclists. So the benefits then, just to wrap up, obviously offers the potential for more and different types of people to engage with cycling outdoors. I should say our participants weren't like kind of hardcore keen cyclists. They're very much people that were tempted to get back into cycling for health or to recover from an injury or a physical defect. Or because they were just very interested in trying out e-bikes. They weren't sure what they were about and wanted to give it a go. So we've just got an article coming out in the Journal of Active Travel Studies anytime soon, which really covers the qualitative dimension of our research, the diaries and the narratives, the storylines people gave of what we've called their ranging behaviour. So very much like cats leaving your home, kind of ranging further and further on the e-bikes. And for those interested in the kind of science of the cognitive tests, there's a link there to the paper that we published in PLOS ONE a couple of years ago. So just to finish then, what did we do with this research? I mean, it's always a big question for researchers. Do we go one step further and suggest what this means for policy, or do we just shut up and say, well, this is what we found out? Or we put a head on the block really and said, right, this is what we think it means for age-friendly cities, really. We use the WHO's age-friendly cities framework, their different domains. And I'm just going to give you an example here of some of the domains. So for outdoor spaces and buildings, transportation, housing, we very much talked about the need for dedicated, separated cycle infrastructure for e-biking and general cycling. Improved junctions, things like low-level signals, low speed zones, consistency and coherency in design and surface quality, catering for different types of bikes and cyclists, especially for public hire schemes. So just an aside from that, I also visited Munich for a conference, and it was interesting to see all of their hire bikes, public hire schemes and electric ones included, had step-through frames, and they also had standard child carriers on the back. So, as standard for all of the bikes. Private and communal cycle storage at new developments and retrofit. I know that's coming in terms of electric cars, but I think there's a way to go in terms of standardizing and just locking in, as you can see in figure 36 from our report, just standard cycle parking and electric charge points outside of the homes. We also look beyond that, obviously, to social support, thinking about specific training for older people, but also specific bikeability training for e-bikes, as there wasn't at that time. And then increased awareness of drivers to vulnerable users. So in terms of age-friendly cities, we're very much thinking about across the life course and aging as a process. So what will benefit older people will also benefit the very young. We also talk very much about a national e-bike support program to recognise and promote the health and wellbeing benefits, fun, freedom, social interaction, also tackling the misperception of stigma. And even amongst their own participants, when they signed up, they didn't really understand that it was power assist. So there is really a misunderstanding, and in some quarters, a bit of stigma in the sense that it's regarded as cheating, as Antonia alluded to earlier. Thinking about providing tax incentives for battery replacement or even for purchasing e-bikes to begin with. Bespoke e-bike training, which I've mentioned. Support for e-cycle tryout public events, which we felt was very important, as people were at that time weren't very exposed to e-cycles and weren't really aware of what they are. So definitely support for in town centres or public events where people can walk by and inquire, and a touch and feel event, if you like, and a tryout event. And then also importantly, we found that, again, as I mentioned earlier, I was also working in the Netherlands at this point, and colleagues there were very much talking about statistics from the Dutch travel survey, collecting data on e-bike use, whereas of course our national travel survey doesn't really distinguish between what bicycles people use. So the Dutch very much are able to plan for that, look at the trends, make the case to policymakers for investment, whereas we don't have that level of intelligence, unfortunately. I think since then there's been a glut of research on e-biking. So I'm just going to flag one here. Jessica Bourne's paper is very good, where she's done a scoping review of the impact of e-cycling on travel behaviour in the Journal of Transport and Health. That was December last year, so quite, not too distant. And there's various others as well, which give you more of a kind of systematic view as to what the e-bike research is saying. Then final couple of slides, and then to summarise, there has been activity, as many of you probably know, since we published our report in 2016. It's really great to see that the gear change, the Bold Visions for Cycling and Walking, really does talk about establishing a national e-bike support programme. It remains to be seen how extensive that is, but obviously there's already been some initiatives, the e-cycle fund, the cycle extension fund. Some of you might be using that at the moment, and expanding schemes. So that's really good to see the momentum building here, and particularly Transport for London's been ahead of the game, I think, in terms of rolling out e-biking. So to summarise then, I think there's implications really for what I call an electric micro-mobility future, because obviously a lot of attention's on electric cars, but we shouldn't ignore the potential for e-micro-mobility, and that's e-bikes, but also we're seeing e-scooters trials on streets in some cities in Oxford, where I am based at the moment. E-scooters whizzing around, and mixed opinions on whether it's good, it's bad, is it sustainable, unsustainable, is it equitable, is it inequitable? So lots of debates around that that require researching and understanding. But we need to look at whether they offer benefits more broadly to individual mobility in terms of independence, an opportunity to get outdoors, discover new places, interact, socialise. We also need to consider, from a public health perspective, the benefits and disbenefits, i.e., on the one hand, connecting with people, on the other hand, what about disharmony with other road users? So lots of debate there, heated debate. And then there's obviously the environmental benefits and environmental considerations, with outside of a life cycle analysis, I should say, but, and then more broadly in a life cycle analysis, because this has obviously got implications for travel behaviour, transport inequalities, how we design infrastructure, what regulations we bring in to create a kind of safer and more harmonious environment. So I think the probably jury's still out on e-scooters. I would say that the jury is possibly, and looking at the poll earlier, has made more of a decision on e-bikes as a good thing, as part of a sustainable, healthy and an age-friendly city. I think that's pretty much agreed, although there are some quarters still a bit resistant to that. But I think the real challenge is other electric micromobilities and how they are conceived, and whether and how we should plan for them. And to that end, just to finish, I'll just draw your attention to a special issue that should come out next year in Active Travel Studies that I am guest editing with two other colleagues at Brooks and at UWE Bristol, which very much is looking at electric micromobility futures. So we will have a wider range of papers in there, 10 plus, which really do investigate and reveal the kind of pros and cons of those different means of moving around. So look out for that. So that's all I wanted to say. I look forward to question and answers. There's lots more that can be said, but obviously with the limited time available, I'll end it there. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Tim. Really interesting stuff. I've been following the Cycle Boom stuff for a little while, and I think it's just really important that we have this evidence to be able to draw upon, to be able to support this kind of investment. So a couple of questions for you. One about whether you actually did any specific measurements in terms of the mental health outcomes. Did you use any of those kind of standardized surveys around depression, anxiety, or indicators that can give you quantitative kind of measurements of those improvements?
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. Yes, I mean, that's all in our +1 paper, where we did very much use a battery of tests, cognitive tests, and they're all well validated and reliable measures in the field of psychology and neuroscience. We had the standard kind of subjective well-being tests that the WHO use. The cognitive tests themselves, they are what we called a battery, because there were things like, I'm not an expert on these tests, by the way, because my colleagues at University of Reading in neuroscience ran the tests, but things like the Stroop test, if that means anything to anybody, tests for spatial awareness, reaction times. So there was about 10 or 12 set tests that people sat through for 2 hours on a laptop, and also paper and pencil tests. And again, those are repeated at the end of the trial. And, a before and after, what's called a t-test statistically, was used to measure the change and also the effect sizes of those changes. And that's all in the +1 paper for the people that are very interested in those tests and how we measured and what the results were. So I do encourage you to have a look at that.
And in terms of the cognitive improvements that you saw, do you think that was particularly because the kind of the group that you were looking at perhaps had a drop off in those abilities already, or do you think you would see that cognitive uplift for across all demographics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously it's a selective sample, really, isn't it? We put the adverts out there in Reading and Oxford. We had over 600 people, if I recall, that stepped up to want to take part. So it really was a threshing exercise to whittle it down. So we did have a criteria for selection at that point, obviously age being a key criteria, but also looking at whether what sort of extent of the hiatus was between not cycling, having given up cycling, the reasons for that, and also gender, looking at balance and ethnicity. So we tried to get a varied sample, and you'll see that on our website in terms of the ones we selected for the Vox Pops and the videos. They very kindly agreed to take part in that. Yeah, I mean, it was a mix, really. It's probably, I haven't got time to sort of go into each individual account, but what I'd urge you to do is look at some of the video vignettes. They're only like 5 minutes, but you kind of get a real insight into the people's reasons as to why they took part and how it made them feel. Because we felt that it's obviously very good to have those cognitive tests and the brute facts and the hard science in terms of subjective well-being, but also reaction times and all the tried and tested psychological tests. But there's nothing like having the kind of participants' human side of how they felt, what their embodied feelings were while they were riding, what it meant to them in terms of self-esteem, confidence, all of those things. So that's really brought out in our active travel studies paper. But, for those of you who don't want to go into reading the article, I don't assume you want to, but you definitely have a look at, say, Brian's video or some of the video vignettes, and it will really give you a sense of how the e-bike was just more than, pedaling a contraption. It was much more than that. I have to also say, I guess when we do research, I'm definitely of an academic bent where I declare my positionality on what I think about the subject rather than be dispassionate, disinterested, because obviously I'm interested in e-bikes, otherwise I wouldn't have researched them. I didn't really have a strong view on e-bikes when I went to the research. I just thought it was very interesting technology, evolving technology. And I was interested why it was very established in the Netherlands, a high cycling nation. But there was some sort of dissonance in England about, is it good, is it bad? And a large part of snobbery, I might say, in terms of, it's not proper cycling. Even from a local authority I presented at earlier, the research very much talked about, actually, that's not for our city. We don't really want to promote e-bikes. So, I was very interested in that, having not had any evidence of whether they're good or bad. So I was interested to see how it would work out and what our tests would say, but also how our participants found it. And I got to admit, at the end of it, if then you looked at my positionality, I would definitely say I was a proponent for e-bikes as part of an age-friendly society, a sustainable transport policy for health and well-being. Absolutely. And indeed, just to summarize on that point, we did strongly make that point in our research that we shouldn't look at health in terms of just physical activity and saying, a regular pedal cycle gives you this much energy expenditure per minute versus an e-bike this, because it's much broader than that. The mental health and well-being benefits are really, really important to take into the discussion as well.
Absolutely. So we're running out of time for questions at the moment, but hopefully we'll have some time at the end to bring everybody back on. Thank you ever so much. I really appreciated hearing some of the that case studies fleshed out for us. So thank you ever so much, Tim. I'll now ask David Finch, who has arrived and managed to log in. I think we've all had some technical problems this morning, so I very much sympathise with you. From the Health Foundation, to talk to us about this relationship between transport and health, and what lessons you've been learning through your research in terms of how we can actually manipulate our environment, our infrastructure, our modes of transport to be able to improve health along the way. Thanks, David.
Great, thank you. And thank you for bearing with me as I got logged on. I'm from the Health Foundation, which is a independent organisation. It's a charity, and we do a range of activity from funding different types of interventions through to policy research and analysis. And it's all with the aim of improving health and reducing health inequalities. So I was going to start off with a bit more context about kind of what motivates us at the Health Foundation, and then talk about how the different ways in which transport influences people's health, and finish off thinking a bit about how there are the challenges that exist to making a more healthy transport system, given the kind of high level of car dependence within the UK. So I'll start with a bit of background about the Health Foundation. So I think many people, when they hear health, tend to think about kind of healthcare or social care. That's certainly the kind of the narrative we hear in the media. But our part of the Health Foundation, which is Healthy Lives, is very much about all the other things that go on in society, the circumstances we live in, the experiences we have day to day. That there are actually greater influences on our health overall than simply the healthcare system. And these are things that we tend to call them wider determinants of health. And these include education, employment, housing, and of course, transport as well. And as well as a focus on improving health, the other aspect we think is really important are health inequalities. So clearly there's been a lot of focus on this through the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, there was a 20-year gap in healthy life expectancy between the least and most deprived areas. And this chart is just setting out life expectancy, which are the blue bars, and healthy life expectancy, which are the red bars, for local areas ranked, small local areas ranked by their level of deprivation. So the most deprived is at the top of that chart and the least deprived at the bottom. And I mean, the key point here is that there's a 20-year gap between the red bars at the top and the bottom, but also that not only are people in those most deprived areas living a shorter life, they're living a greater proportion of it in poor health, which is the kind of size of the blue bar that's visible at the top. And when we look at determinants of health, there are often very many aspects of inequality, which I think have partly come up already. And those are some of the things that I will touch on as we go through, in the links to transport. So how does transport affect health? Well, there are four kind of main ways that we think about transport affecting health. One of them is active travel, which is obviously very relevant to this conversation, and this is very much about the extent to which the transport system enables people to be active within it. So people kind of having walking and cycling within the standard kind of journeys that they make from day to day. There's a pollution aspect from air and noise pollution. So I think the fairly obvious route through pollution causing respiratory issues, but also that noise can also cause stress for people. And that's certainly one aspect, or one of these mechanisms that's very patterned by socioeconomic background, where you tend to find people in more deprived areas are at greater exposure to air and noise pollution. The next aspect is a very direct mechanism through, which is road safety. So things like accidents, which have a very sort of direct impact on people's health. And then also, and I think this was touched on in the previous section, is the kind of social exclusion element. So this is how your transport networks are effectively linking you up to other parts of society. So that's things for like work, but also public services and more social activity, which has an important impact for sort of mental and physical health. So the ones I'm going to probably most relevant today that I will focus on are kind of the active travel and social exclusion aspects. Although I think there are also, they're also interlinked, that to some extent there are also impacts for the other two factors as well, around air and noise pollution and road safety. So some of our analysis, which we try to understand the kind of association between different aspects of different determinants in health. And this chart is perhaps, I suppose, an obvious one, where it's plotting physical activity levels against the extent to which people are walking and cycling in their journeys within local areas. And there's a really clear pattern there where the less kind of active types of transport journeys people are making, the poorer, the lower the physical activity levels in those areas. The higher the obesity rates in those areas, which is perhaps obvious, and there's clearly a two-way mechanisms there. But I think it's a kind of, it's an important thing to notice, and it's not just, these aren't individuals, this is the kind of share within a local area. Another piece of analysis we've done, which is to try and to understand the kind of impact that active travel could have to improve health. And this is using the World Health Organization's HEAT tool, where we modeled a couple of scenarios. One was lifting people, the active physical, so walking and cycling activity, up to the kind of the maximum for a region within the UK, which doing that meant if there was an increase in walking and cycling to that level in different regions, then there would be a reduction in around 1,200 avoidable deaths each year. But I think a really key thing within that analysis is that the base is so low that you're starting from in the first place, that actually just increasing walking or cycling by around by 30 minutes a week would have actually resulted in around 6,000 fewer deaths. So there's a kind of, although with the lower end of that was trying to sort of match to a kind of real world scenario where you're actually matching to the best performer, essentially, the starting point is really low. So I think that's a kind of interesting point, in that there's clearly lots of scope to improve the level of such kind of physical activity within an active travel framework, but there's a kind of a long and sort of persistent low level of activity that we're moving from. So there's a lot of space to improve into, but a long history of not having very high levels of those things in the first place. Which kind of leads me on to my next section, which is if there are such clear health benefits, and I think the mechanisms that are set out are fairly well known and quite obvious things. There's some clear health benefits from doing these things. So why potentially aren't we seeing greater progress, and what are some of the challenges around that? So I think the first one is just to take a bit of a longer step back and look at how travel patterns have changed over the last 70 years in this example. So that each line is a different mode of transport with and how far and the distance travelled by those transport modes per person in each year. And the red line is the total of that. And I think the really clear and obvious trends there are the way that the blue line has increased so much, and that's travel effectively by car, down as private transport there. And that's really making up the majority, or the vast majority of the distance people are traveling, if you compare that gap to the kind of red line. And what that gap is made up of is the lines towards the bottom, where we've got kind of bus travel, rail, and also cycling. And I think that there is bus uses clearly declined over that longer term period. Train use has increased to some extent in the past, in more recent years, and then cycling has remained kind of relatively low all the way through there. So there's kind of just very like two big things stand out, which is the massive growth in car use over that period, and then also the dominance of it as a mode of transport, which I think has important then implications for health and making changes to the system to better support health. So I think there are three kind of key factors here that have their kind of risks for health, and also their kind of challenges in trying to alter the current structures. So one issue is just with dominance of car use means marginalising other road users. So this is partly a safety aspect where people may be put off from activity like cycling, but also that it has an impact on the effectiveness of those other types of transport use. I think we saw earlier the map of someone taking a fairly convoluted route to get somewhere, so that they were going through a kind of better environment. But then also a knock-on to reduction in public transport services. We have a bit of a cycle of fewer people will be demanding the public transport services, which leads to a reduction potentially in their quality of those services, and more difficulty in those services being timely because of the potential traffic created by more cars. And from the kind of health perspective, public transport particularly offers a kind of affordable and potentially an affordable way in which people can access work and also other types of public services. And then final point around reshaping the built environment, in that that pure dominance of cars means that effectively a lot of our environment is built around the usage of cars, which has knock-on effects of discouraging other types of activity, particularly that kind of more active transport angle if you're designing for the use of cars rather than pedestrians or cycling. And I think there's there are clearly arguments about, for example, if we were considering is dominance of car all bad? There are arguments potentially that if you can convert to more electric car use, then that will tackle some of the pollution aspect. But there's also there are also affordability elements here where despite having that kind of dominance of car use, the access to cars is limited for some people, and particularly those from lower income households. So these lines are showing different, each line is representing a different chunk of the income distribution, with the poorest 20% at the top in the red line, and the richest 20% at the kind of what I believe is a blue from my screen line at the bottom. And I mean, the trend has stayed fairly stable over time, but it's clear around just over a third of or around a third of people in the bottom quintile don't have lack access to a car, which clearly has implications if those other methods of transport use are limited, and car use is so dominant. And a kind of flip side argument of this as well is that the majority of people rely on their car to get to work. So you have kind of almost a dual tension there, where people are perhaps less willing to try other types of transport activity because of their need, because of a kind of what they would perceive as their need to access work through their cars. And then a final kind of another kind of high level aspect to this is that even for people that are using public and active transport systems, and problems, there are some, there's about a third to 2/5 of people will experience problems with at least one problem with using that mode of transport, which can have a knock-on effect of either kind of putting people off using those modes unless they have to. One of the big factors here is quality that tends to come through, and that kind of can include the kind of quality of the public transport system, but also some kind of safety fears as well in the usage. So those are kind of some of the high level challenges there that are within the current system. But I think there are, from a kind of more positive outlook there, where there's some of the kind of negative consequences, but there are clearly opportunities for change. There's at least a narrative of greater investment in the transport systems, and we've also had the kind of interest in climate change, which potentially, there are many similarities between the arguments for, or some of the changes you would support to make a healthier transport system that align with the climate change agenda as well. And these are kind of three fairly sort of broad aims that we think are kind of important to think about in trying to shift the structure of the transport system. And one is recognizing that I think it's clearly going to be a long-term effort, and I don't think this can be something that will happen quickly, at least not at full scale. But some key things to bear in mind are kind of greater coordination of new infrastructure projects, so that creating that kind of more active transport system is put into the heart of that design, and thinking about particularly improving connecting up communities, increasing the kind of safe cycling and walking facilities that are available to people as part of that, and also wider transport planning, and also thinking about increasing the availability and kind of reliability and affordability of public transport services, which is trying to offer a more, I suppose, a more viable alternative to people to help shift some of that behaviour away from stronger car use. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That's really interesting stuff there. There's a lot to digest in that. So thank you so much. We've got time for a couple of questions. I'm really interested to ask you about how the health sector, the public health, has obviously got behind active travel. But how much do you think that sector could get behind the need to reduce car dependency, and particularly the aspects you're talking about the the dominance on our street and the way we have we manage the built environment, in the same way as we've had a shift in terms of smoke, how we manage people smoking, and what do you think could be done in terms of that sector influencing the transport agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's potentially two kind of key mechanisms through which you could start to approach that. I mean, one is the role of the public health directors of public health and people working in the public health system at a local level who can help to be, I suppose, more involved in planning and decision making, so people are aware of these issues and trying to be involved in kind of key decision points. There's a program of work we are funding at the moment called Economies for Healthier Lives, where one of our award holders there is Glasgow, and they are effectively trialing a kind of a health impact assessment through different capital investment within the city over the next 3 years. And so they're very much going, I mean, they're at the beginning of that work now, but they're really going to dig into all the different key decision points through the local authority and planning moments where decisions are made that could have an impact on health. And I think that kind of hopefully some of the findings from that will be useful in helping other local areas think about how the decisions they're making have an impact through health. But I think the other big one is the kind of, obviously the NHS and the kind of healthcare sector is a large thing. It has a big imprint on its local area. So if you think of the kind of NHS as an anchor to some extent, then there are, and I mean, I don't think this is particularly happening. So although I'm saying this, I don't think it's a kind of a strand that is happening. But clearly, when you are making plans to build healthcare facilities, then taking into account some of that thought, thinking about kind of car dependence within that is probably something that could be done. I suppose the challenges there are the fact that people in poor health perhaps prefer to use some mode of private transport, which would make it quite, I think, perhaps more difficult in a way. But I would think through the more primary care system, there's opportunities to try and to just think about the design of new healthcare facilities and recognise the kind of need for good public transport links into those.
And which do you think is the impact that resonates the most? You think actually hits home the most in terms of influencing policymakers? Is it things around obesity, or is it pollution, asthma with children. We've had some cases over this last year, haven't we, of people being brought to court around asthma? Or is it safety? Which policy area do you think is the one that really you can make some leverage with?
Well, I mean, the two that sort of stand out at the moment would be two of the ones you mentioned, in fact. So I think things that are linked into the climate change agenda are clearly something that's on the radar of all departments now, and is something that where there are arguments that align. I think there's a good opportunity there to have greater kind of impact and influence. But also, I mean, obesity is, I think, a clear priority for the government, and so I think it's often looking for the policy areas that are a current focus for government, and trying to and think about how those present opportunities and align with some wider changes.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we really should be looking to make these links across to the health sector more, to kind of align our strategies going forward. So thank you very much, David. We hopefully will have a bit more time right at the end for group questions, but we make sure we get through all the presentation today. So thank you, David. I'd like to bring up next Laura Elms, who works for HumanForest, which are an excellent e-bike provider in London with some really innovative marketing. So look forward to hearing more about that. Thanks, Laura.
Great, thank you so much. And it's been really interesting to hear some sort of tangible evidence from the health side, really. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, first of all, who HumanForest is, but then also give a bit of a nutshell of the health benefits that we've spoken about at HumanForest of riding, well, cycling in general, but specifically riding an e-bike with us. Then going to veer into some more niche sort of topics, which again at HumanForest we really like talking about. So one is the concept of biophilia, and the other is around eco-anxiety. And then just finish on hopefully a bit of a positive note, why we like to call our electric bikes the happy bike. Bit of a cliche, but still true nonetheless. So HumanForest, we are London's first truly green shared e-bike. We are on a mission to build happier, healthier cities for everyone, starting in London, reforesting our urban environment one e-bike at a time. What we're doing is we're offering every user 10 minutes free on our electric bikes every day. So trying to reduce that price point and broaden the population that's able to access shared electric bikes. We have done a little bit of research and talking about in a few articles and blog posts the benefits of cycling on health and wellness. I think physical activity has been seen in some studies to prevent and manage about 20 chronic conditions. On the flip side of that, physical inactivity has been seen to be responsible for 1 in 6 UK deaths, which is the same as smoking, and is estimated to cost the UK about 7.4 billion annually. So it's something that we can and we are hoping to be able to address slowly and steadily. Bit of a summary now. I'm not a healthcare sort of professional, so this is quite basic research, but obviously cycling relates to endorphins. After about 20 to 30 minutes, those endorphins and cannabinoids will kick in and increase the supply of oxygen to your brain. But also an interesting one, and I think it's been spoken about particularly in Tim's presentation and Brian, which was quite heartwarming, reducing feelings of depression and anxiety. Cycling will fire neurotransmitters, alleviating pain, both physical and mental, low levels of which are often linked to depression. And I read an excerpt of a study in Science Direct, which showed that aerobic exercise like cycling can genuinely have an impact on anxiety. Now, it's definitely something I've experienced, even getting on the bike sort of post-work. I often find on the return journey, there's a huge difference in my mood and anxiety levels when I step through the door at home after a cycle, rather than squeezing myself onto a tube, or worse, sitting in traffic, which is something I can't really bear. Improving heart health, I mean, general cardiovascular fitness is going to benefit. Burning fat, I mean, burning fat isn't something we love talking about at HumanForest, but it is seen to be about 300 calories per hour spent cycling. Obviously, an e-bike is typically less, but also just boosting that metabolic rate, lowering the risk of diabetes. So there was research carried out in Finland showing that people who cycled for 30 minutes or more per day had 40% lower risk of developing diabetes. And something that I think we all need at the moment, given the amount of colds and flus going around, improving immune system response. So cycling can increase your body temperature, which is a way of fighting off viruses. So those are some just very brief, kind of quick facts I wanted to share with you, which nicely link cycling and wellness in sort of very clear and tangible ways. Another kind of concept which I'm very fascinated by, and we've spoken a bit about again in our blogs at HumanForest, is this concept of biophilia. It's less tangible, but it's the concept of the innate sort of tendency for human beings to want to seek connections with each other, with animals, but also with the natural world around us. It's that notion for us of what being outdoors, and for HumanForest, particularly on a bike or e-bike, can do for your mental health. I spoke to a really wonderful psychologist at Harley Street who said a really nice quote I thought I'd share with you, that within our modern era, we often forget that humans are nature. Our bodies are built from nature and fed by the earth, and to disconnect from nature is to forget a vital part of who we are. Nature has the capacity to soothe our nervous system, inspire our senses, and help us remember our innate need for playful curiosity. Now, I mean, it looked, those routes that Tim showed us with Brian moving around Abingdon looked beautiful, but even it can be as simple as riding through a couple of tree-lined streets in the inner city areas can genuinely have a boost on mental health. I think Antonia mentioned actually at the beginning the number of people who were able to reconnect with places in and around the pandemic. And I read a study that showed that in between January 2020 and May 2020, visits to parks in the UK had increased almost 150% compared to the pre-pandemic, which is one of the largest increases seen globally. So it's definitely felt that Brits were feeling a need to reconnect with the world around them as a result of, or as part of, lockdown and the pandemic. Over 17,000 extra outdoor seats were placed in cafes and restaurants across the UK. There was a shift from it to kind of enjoying indoor pleasures outdoors, using it as an opportunity to socialize and reconnect with each other and with the natural world around us. Cognitive function, I think, again, this is something that's been spoken about, and well-being have been shown to increase simply from being outdoors. But there's also been seen to be an augmented improvement in that cognitive function if and when you're on a bike or doing some form of physical exercise. So I think there's space for us to continue to emphasize not just the wellness benefits of being on the bike, but actually connecting and seeing the world around you as and when you travel by bike. Another thing that I really wanted to talk about is the rise of eco-anxiety. Dave, I think you mentioned this. David, I think you mentioned this briefly, but eco-anxiety is generally seen as the fear of environmental doom. This isn't just something that's faced by the few, rather about 78% of people in some studies report some level of eco-anxiety. It's something that is increasing, probably increasing at the same rate as general conversations on the environment. A poll that was taken in August 2021 revealed that public concern for the environment jumped just 16 percentage points in just 1 month between July and August, which is a huge increase if you look at the years preceding it. YouGov poll also found that 2,000 people found that about 56% believe climate change will be a greater sort of threat than to the world than COVID. So what we're seeing is a bit of perspective gathering as well, I think, in some departments. Typically, eco-anxiety has been seen to be something that is seen to be more afflicting the younger generations and those of higher socioeconomic backgrounds. But in fact, studies are showing that it's very much levelling out between both young and old and more and less affluent areas. In fact, the real lines are more between men and women, so women reporting higher levels of eco-anxiety than men. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, I do think there's something that can be done about this directly linked to cycling and companies like ourselves. So 81% of people in a study showed that companies, they wanted companies to be doing more to help improve the environment. So obviously the governments and general policymakers are being put under pressure, but also that's being transferred down to companies. What's also happening, which gives me a lot of hope as well, is the emphasis shifting onto individuals and the decisions that we can make as individuals, and therefore on a bigger level as a collective, to reduce our sort of carbon footprint. I'm going to really butcher this word, but it's a Maori word that's just been added into the Oxford English Dictionary, Katia Katanga. Forgive me if anyone knows how to pronounce that properly, but it's the human duty of responsibility of environmental stewardship. So this emphasis really not just being on policymakers or companies, but on the individual as well. And I think one of the ways that getting on the bike can help is knowing that you're not feeding into a polluting system. What we've done at HumanForest is try to sort of encapsulate that for our users. So we do some interesting things in our app, for example, where if you cycle with HumanForest, every mile you cycle with HumanForest, you are rewarded with 1 tree coin. If you increase that 1 tree coin to 5, you get a 3-minute extra riding. So we're trying to encourage people to kind of take stock of what they're doing, but also to be rewarded for it. So they're not doing it, they're not sort of making a change or going out of their way without a reward. So both the planet and individuals are benefiting. Another great thing that I like to talk about that we've done is we had a launch event in September where we had 50 people cycling from our warehouse in Waterloo up to King's Cross by Coldrops Yard. And we were trying to really rally people around so that around the few weeks of our launch, we would be able to save the equivalent amount of CO2 as Hyde Park consumes in 1 week. So we also had on board, and you can see him here, the Prime Minister's Mental Health Ambassador, Dr. Alex George, as well as Destiny Bocker-Bates, who is the founder of the air pollution group Choked Up. Again, something that Antonio and David spoke about at the end, that sort of asthma element. And they were discussing sort of the benefits of cycling on mental well-being and the consequential improvements to air quality. Dr. Alex George said climate change anxiety is one of the biggest worries for young people. Plenty of studies to suggest that green space and clean air can reduce anxiety and improve mental well-being. HumanForest mission on improving mental health and physical health is a fantastic way to encourage exercise and also to improve the well-being of Londoners. So I guess what I'm trying to pull together here is there's clear evidence to suggest that health is boosted by cycling. Electric bikes make it more accessible to more people. But also there are some more interesting sort of mental health benefits, but also around eco-anxiety and empowering people to make decisions about the way they move that can help the planet and make them feel like they're playing their part. So onto the happy bike. This I have stolen, Antonia, I've stolen your stat from the Como report last year, that 32% of shared e-bike users actively chose to use the schemes for the mental health benefits. So it's not something just academic, it's something that's really coming through. People are feeling those benefits. And again, I think projects like Tim's, where people were told to or asked to sort of report on their feelings in their diaries, really helps people become more mindful of what decisions they're making to get around and how it's affecting their mood. I know often people talk about how they would have never thought of going for a walk before heading off to work in the morning before lockdown. And now where they can, they always try and fit in an extra walk to boost their mental health in the mornings. And it's a similar feeling, I think, for those who shifted from getting public transport or private cars to using bikes to get to and from work. So yes, this is our bike in short. It's all based on carbon neutral operations, all powered by renewable energy in the batteries. They're accessible, so easy to use, that pedal assist that the guys have been talking about beforehand. They're convenient and they're affordable. So that, coming back to that 10 minutes free a day, if we take out that price problem and the pain around pricing, we believe that more people will be encouraged to make the decision. The environment hopefully will benefit from that, but also our physical and mental health as well. So that's really all from me. Just a final note to say, I work on our partnerships at HumanForest. We're always trying to partner with interesting companies, so or not companies, charities as well. So for example, we're working, which is relevant to this topic, with Mind, the mental health charity. We also work with Mr. Porter on their Health and Mind campaign, which is encouraging more men to get out, jump on the bikes, talk with one another about mental health through physical exercise. So if anyone's listening and wants to have a chat about whether HumanForest can work with you in whatever capacity, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks ever so much, Laura. I mean, I think we must be into double figures now of the positive benefits of bikes and the kind of negative impacts of cars. So hopefully we're all feeling really galvanized to go out and do some more about it. I got a question that's kind of, I think you've got really innovative marketing, but I wonder what you think makes the biggest difference in terms of uptake. Do you think it is targeting messages to certain different demographics? Do you think it's engagement activities like training activities? Do you think it's the gamification? You've heard about points or other forms of gamification, or do you think we just need more cycle lanes?
I think I was going to say, yeah, I think it's infrastructure. I mean, obviously there are many things at play. So you look at the moment at the weather outside. It's not particularly motivating to get out and go on a bike. So it's sort of encouraging people maybe through gamification, maybe through targeting and training. But really, I mean, I really do believe that if you build the infrastructure, people will come. And I think there's some amazing evidence of that on social media, where you see the cameras showing the volumes of people cycling across London increasing sort of on a month-by-month basis, or simply as they put in a new cycle lane, suddenly more people will use it. If you use it and you feel safe, you come back and it becomes a habit that's instilled in the way you operate. So yeah, I would say predominantly it's around infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And as a company, you have 100% electric fleet. So I'm wondering how you came about that decision, and how much market kind of analysis you did as to the acceptance for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's that. So it's sort of two things there. One is, I think there's a demand for that. Like I said, I think more people are putting companies in the spotlight and asking, what are you doing? We're a very new company, so we're agile enough to make that decision from the start and it not have a massive impact on any of our revenues, because it's something we've always wanted to do. And then the other side of that is the kind of vision. So we were set up by a great guy called Agustin. He worked at Cabify, and Cabify was the first unicorn, but also first in the ride hailing industry, but also the first to go net zero. So he was very keen on that concept and has always wanted to put the environment at the heart of what we do, hence the name HumanForest. So his sort of idea is that we all as humans can work together to prevent CO2 from being released into the atmosphere. So we become, in essence, a human forest by the decisions we make. So yeah, I think that's always just been at the heart and the core of what we do and who we are.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Laura. Hopefully we'll have time for a few more questions with everybody at the end. But yeah, really appreciate your input and look forward to hearing more about you as you expand across London. So now it's down to myself just to sort of share a few more slides to give you a little bit more evidence. I think it's important that we do have the evidence, and this is some highlights from just trying to find out how to advance it. I'm not been able to advance it at the moment, so maybe Dave, you could help. Oh, there we go. Yeah, we've got 6 years of evidence now from the bike share survey. So hopefully these kind of stats will help to feed into those of you influencing policy. So we're going to start off with a poll, a quick quiz question. What percentage of bike share users have returned to cycling after a gap of a year or more? So who, when they joined a bike share scheme, hadn't cycled for a year or more? Okay. So here's the results coming up. So you've all gone, oh no, there we go, neck and neck. Oh, no, it's kind of feeding through. People are undecided between 23 or 49%. Pretty neck and neck. Okay. In the interest of time, I will give you the answer, but I might have to ask Dave to help me advance my slides because that seems to be working for me. So the answer is actually 49%. So yeah, roughly half of people, and we see this consistently over the last 6 years, have said that they were returning to cycling after a gap of a year or more. 24% was 5 years or more, and 6% were brand new to cycling. So it really is a kind of key mechanism for overcoming the barriers, taking away the worry about purchase, the worry about storage, the worries about maintenance, etc. Yeah, and as well as new riders, we're getting new trips. So 60% or more of people are saying that they are cycling more as a result. And it's 21% of those are saying that they're cycling much more often, which increases up to 29% when we're looking at e-bikes. So it's this kind of idea of integrating cycling into everyday activity, providing bikes in really convenient locations, which helps to just make it more easier to be able to integrate it into your lives. Next slide. Sound like Chris Whitty. And then we've been hearing a lot about the e-bikes, and I really wanted to kind of highlight this stat because I think it's really quite amazing. You know, 5 years ago we had 2 schemes that had e-bikes, and there was a pretty small fleet then. Now we've got 21 schemes with e-bikes, and 12 of them are pure electric. And on the next slide, you'll see where we look at the reasons for that, for people choosing their e-bikes. And yes, there's a fair amount of people that want them to be able to cycle up hills or because they've got health difficulties, and it's brilliant that we're offering that kind of diversity of choice. But there's also an awful lot of people that just want to be able to use the e-bikes to be able to enjoy cycling and to arrive on their journey without feeling sweaty or tired. So it really is a tool for everybody, I think. And that in that way, we're seeing that people are able to get a good proportion of their weekly expected exercise allowance for the week through bike share. So 70% said that bike share was contributing to it, 20% of people said that it was all of their physical activity for the week. I think the next slide is about ownership. Yeah, so bike share is definitely seen as a complement to ownership. We consistently see around 10% of people go on to buy a bike having been introduced to it through bike share, and then around 44% are able to use the two together. So it's a bit like how you might use a taxi as a complement to a car. It's it's using the modes that suit the journey best and having that greater choice. And even so, because you've got that kind of diversity of offer, we're able to see that reduction in car use. And obviously this then plays to what David was talking about in terms of the wider community health benefits. So the reduction in noise, the reduction in pollution, the safety issues. And this was particularly high this year. So we're still kind of investigating this about across regional kind of variations. Because I think in terms of less dense cities with poorer public transport, we're seeing a greater uplift, and there could also be a COVID effect in here. But either way, it's really positive news. And in fact, actually, if you then look at the next stat, which is about e-bikes, looking particularly at e-bikes. So onto the next slide. We ask another question about how many miles people are typically reducing their car use by using bike share, and we saw an uplift between those that were from using e-bikes to using bike share. So it's obviously allowing people to add new trips, extra trips, and longer trips as a result of access to e-bikes. A new question to the survey this year was around interest in specialist bikes. And you may well have heard about the new e-cargo bike schemes that have been launched in Manchester and London this year. In fact, we're going to hear about the Manchester one in the session that's just coming up next. So there's obviously a real appetite for diversifying fleets within bike share and making them more inclusive. Now, there's obviously lots of logistical issues here, but hopefully this is something that we can start to trial and learn more about and work on as we go forward. So just to end my slides on some of quotes that we see, and this is always my favourite bit of looking at the survey, because it really helps to bring to life those impacts like Tim's videos do. So, I'm a student and I love cycling to uni every day. Electric cycling through the meadows nearby is peaceful and beautiful. It's helped me feel really good in the morning, mood-wise. And another person said that they'd lost 2 stone and gained the confidence to ride a bike again. So really lovely to kind of see those kind of positive comments. And the full survey will be out in the new year. So really look forward to be able to share the full results with you. If you've got any questions about it, feel free to pitch in. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because I was really keen that we had another 5 minutes on the end just to bring everybody back onto the stage to have a time for a few more questions. Now, there was a question earlier that I remembered, which I really wanted to put to all you guys. Thank you for coming back on. Which was around 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is something that we're hearing a lot about this year. And what do we think that e-bikes could do to contribute to perhaps developing 20-minute neighbourhoods, or maybe even extending them a little bit? Tim, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's quite a thought-provoking question for a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Well, I guess for those that don't know, this 20-minute concept is about the A word, really, accessibility to everyday goods and services we rely on to kind of reproduce our everyday lives. So indeed, I guess e-bikes could be used to facilitate that idea. It could expand that range of access within 20 minutes, I guess. I suppose from my point of view, I'd be a bit cautious about only focusing on that in the silos, because it's almost falling into the same trap as looking at the motor car of time space compression. So yeah, because it is about the journey between A and B and not just kind of getting from A to B. So yeah, I think I would look at it in the round, I wouldn't like to just focus on the e-bike for 20-minute cities. You know, I'd probably look at it more broadly than that, holistically.
Okay. Anyone else wanted to come in on that point?
I do. We've seen a lot of data so far suggesting that people are much more comfortable taking longer journeys using the e-bike, and I think that comes back to what Tim showed us around that security of knowing that you can get home without the fear, if you like, of getting exhausted or getting stuck somewhere. So I do think that it opens up a lot of space, having that sort of e-bike, and I also do kind of agree with you, Tim, that it doesn't, we shouldn't necessarily be sticking wholly to that model of the 20 minutes, but broadening it more.
Okay. And to carry on with yourself, Laura, there's a question about the role of e-bikes in more rural areas or outside of urban core. So how do you think you could make bike share work in those kind of environments?
That's a very tricky question, one that I would love to be able to answer in the next 10 minutes, but I'm not sure we'll be able to make it. I think there's a lot for us as an operator around operational costs. So the operational costs typically of shared mobility providers are extremely high, and that obviously gets compounded by things like vandalism. When you can't monitor the bike so easily and so frequently as you can in urban areas, then that vandalism rates will unfortunately go up and more lost bikes, and that churn on the bikes has such a big impact for us. There are some things that we've started to implement already within urban areas to kind of remedy that. So one of the things is building inbuilt alarm systems, so that if someone tries to move the bike without having unlocked it in the app, then it will set off an alarm, or having it all powered by the app, no physical infrastructure. So there are some ways that we can try and reduce those operational costs, and I think that will really help us emulate our schemes that we have within the urban area into more rural areas. I think there's a lot more work to be done, particularly might be solved with the mobility hubs, which I've seen obviously on previous panels this morning, lots of people talking about. If we can have those mobility hubs where we have operations and we have space to manage the bikes as a hub from there, as that hub and spoke model, that could work. The other one that's really interesting, personally I find really fascinating, is trying to think about how we do it for things like schools. So I know we talked about healthcare and the infrastructure around that, but sort of schools, so that you not only have existing parents or caregivers taking the children on bikes or non-carbon emitting forms of transport, but also integrating it into children's mentality so it goes forward and there's not such a fear of making their school commute or any commutes as they get older. So I think in short, I think it's incredibly tricky to try and find ways, but there will be ways that come, and as we improve the model in an urban area, we can try and build it out and be creative about it.
Sure. Okay. Question for David. So what about, how can we kind of really support people, do you think, to kind of, if they're concerned about, perhaps not being healthy enough to get into cycling? How can we kind of overcome those barriers, do you think?
I mean, I would say from an immediate barrier, that clearly the e-bike offers that thing of people not needing to be too concerned about, being under their own power as such the whole time. I think there's a kind of, I suppose it's wider barriers to people's, it's kind of more their daily behaviours and what they do, their patterns of partly work patterns, but the patterns of what they're doing day to day, and making sure you can, I think, trying to find ways that I suppose enable people to exercise and be more physically active without it being necessarily a kind of special event that you have to go and do. It's more that it's just what people are doing, and is just, I suppose, a more an easier choice for people to make, essentially. So I think there's there's convenience to bring in, and probably just wider norms to try and establish, where people are seeing that this is what everyone as such is doing, and it doesn't feel like a kind of unique event that is something they have to go and do. But I do think the clearly the element of e-bikes that gives you that extra bit of support, that means you don't have to be concerned about not being able to get back, or it's something taking too much effort. Is I suppose there's clearly advantages there.
Okay, 30 seconds for Tim, last comment, and then we really have to close or I'll get in trouble.
Yeah, I think David makes a good point, really. I mean, I'd sum it up like this, really. Cycling's got to become pedestrian. It's got to be as mundane and as boring as being a pedestrian. Just so common sense, so easy. And that obviously requires lots of levers. It needs the infrastructure there as standard, and that supports a wide range of society. It needs people not to have to dress up in special clothes. It just needs to be as simple as putting on shoes, putting the bike between your legs, or even in a different position and carrying on, and that's seen as normal. That's
Perfect.
The key, really.
Great message to end on. Thank you ever so much to all our panelists. Really appreciate it. On next, in 15 minutes, we've got a session all about powered micromobility and what we've learned over the last 12 months. Thank you all so much, and goodbye.